Australia's tropical rainforests have become the first in the world to release more carbon than they absorb, according to a new study. Rainforests are often referred to as carbon sinks, as they absorb more carbon dioxide than they emit. Analysis from Queensland forests has found that extreme temperatures have caused more tree deaths and new growths. The study was published in the science journal Nature. Dr. Hannah Carle from Western Sydney University said current models may overestimate the capacity of tropical rainforests to help offset fossil fuel emissions. Now, to talk about this in more detail, I'm joined by Professor Andrew Scott, a British geologist. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me on the programme today.
Thank you.
It's great to have you with us. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role of a rainforest when it comes to stabilising our climate?
Yes, I think the point about rainforests is that they have such a vast amount of vegetation. And they suck up the carbon dioxide and, of course, give off oxygen in return. And that CO2 goes to help build the trees and the other plants that grow in the rainforest. So it's a very, very thick lot of vegetation. Now, the problem then is, and of course, being a rainforest, it means it's often very wet. And so if there's any fire, they tend to be generally, in a normal rainforest, you might have one tree which will burn. It won't tend to spread because the vegetation is so wet. But of course, if it's been extensive dry periods, then any fire can then spread and destroy large amounts of vegetation. It has three effects, really. It kills the large trees which are drawing down large amounts of CO2. It also has the impact that is in that smoke, there's a lot of CO2 giving off during the fire. So you get vast amounts of CO2 going up into the atmosphere. Some of that plant material gets preserved as charcoal, which gets buried, and then that acts as a carbon sink, which is good. The problem then is the forest is slow to regenerate. So the amount of vegetation which is drawing up CO2 then reduces. So you have this problem of the net effect then is more CO2 going in the atmosphere than actually being drawn back into the rainforest. And of course, as you know, in many parts of the world, it's the rainforests which actually are the vast, in terms of on land environments, which draw down the most CO2 and help stabilize our atmosphere.
The report says there's not enough tree growths to offset the carbon released. Could we help that by planting more trees, or is the situation worse than that?
No, it's worse than that, because it's not a matter of us planting the tree. The trees will regenerate, or there'll be a seed bank from which trees will regenerate. It's just a matter of the fact that they take a long time to grow. So you're not going to be planting mature trees. And in some respects, if we start planting, then what you don't want to do is plant the wrong trees. And you don't want to then, as climate changes, then of course the sort of variety of trees which will do better need to get there automatically, rather than us try to predict. It is one of the big problems we have in terms of any forest, which you think it's an easy solution, we just plant more trees. But if you plant the wrong trees in the wrong place, you actually create more problems than you have. This is a really quite complicated situation that I think it's difficult for most people to handle. I think as Christians, we have a responsibility to try and understand how we care best for the earth. But unfortunately, it is also the case that there is no simple answers. Often they are more complicated. And I think trying to unravel this and unpack it, actually, we might need to talk a little bit more, because I think at the moment there are no easy solutions. Everybody thinks, it's an easy solution, we just go and plant all these trees in this place. It's the case, probably in the UK, we've just had the announcement, there's been the largest amount of wildfire that we've had ever since our records have began. And of course, the people say, we should just plant more trees. Well, that's all very well, but of course the trees will be small initially. But if you then plant the wrong trees, then you can actually have a problem down the line as well. So it is a very difficult balancing act, if you like. And I'm not quite sure how we get people to understand the complexity, because most of us involved in it don't understand the complexities. And I think that's the biggest issue, because everybody wants certainty. Here's a certain answer to a question, and therefore it becomes incumbent on us to actually learn more. And I think, as a Christian community, particularly, there's this kind of thought, well, maybe we're destroying God's world, or we're doing this, or we're doing that. And people then say, oh, well, these people were wrong in burning fossil fuels, or they were wrong in something else. But actually, in the most part, most of these were done at periods when we don't understand the impact of our different developments. And so you might say, well, we developed the idea to burn coal so we could develop and help poor people in terms of getting the economy in a better state. But of course, then you had the problem that people didn't realize the link between burning coal, for example, and increased CO2. But then there was a problem, well, okay, when people started seeing that coal might have a problem, one of the big issues during when I was growing up was acid rain. I don't know, most people probably forgotten about acid rain. And so one of the drivers then was to try, how can we get out that CO2 out the emissions? So we found a way of getting the sulfur dioxide out of the emissions, and most people don't realize that that's actually a product in your own homes, because most of the plasterboard in most people's houses came from the scrubbing of sulfur dioxide from coal-fired power stations, rather than mining the gypsum in a mine. And so therefore, if you stop the coal burning and scrubbing, you actually then don't have that source of gypsum for your plasterboards. But then you say, well, okay, now we know that burning coal is a problem for CO2 emissions. So you say, well, let's stop that. But one possibility was, years ago, we had the possibility of burying the CO2. But because it's expensive and it represents a long-term investment, politicians often don't like, a long-term solution. Now we have a problem that in terms of climate change, again, people say, why didn't we foresee some of these things? Well, our understanding of climate change has increased rapidly over the last 30 years. And in fact, it's accelerated. As we get better computing, we get better observational data, we understand things more and more. And so at each sort of generation, we have different problems with different solutions, and how to tackle it is no easy solution. So I think, we need to really try to educate ourselves generally of what are the implications of one action. It's like saying, well, let's stop burning oil. And this business of, well, let's stop having oil. But then you can realize if you don't take the oil out of the ground at all, then of course, where are you going to get all those plastics you use for the underground pipe works, which you use for the generation or transmission of other forms of power, and so on. So again, I think we need to think very carefully on how we can understand this. Now, the other problem we face is that whatever happens, we're going to have to understand whether or not it's to do with reducing carbon dioxide emissions ourselves in some way, or whether we have to take note of the fact that we're in a changing climate. There are remedial actions which are going to be costly. Whatever you do, it's going to cost. And I think none of us are really kind of prepared for this long-term impact that we're going to have. In one way or another, it's going to cost us all. And therefore, we have to think, well, okay, how can I, not as an individual, do something about that, but perhaps also pray about what we can help people understand in the broader sense. Not just say, oh, well, it's a scientist's problem or it's someone else's problem. It's actually all of our problem, that we need to try to talk to each other, try to understand what these different actions are. And don't blame people because we don't know all the answers straight away. Because as a scientist, it's important for people to realize that we're forever progressing in our understanding. And I think one of the issues is you even heard it on the on the TV recently from a very famous person. Oh, well, we used to complain about going into an ice age, and now we're going into a greenhouse. Oh, why were these scientists always changing their minds? Well, the answer is we're learning all the time. We're finding out more information. We've got more ability to find out from, for example, satellite imagery. So we can see how the world burns. We can measure the amount of CO2 going up into the atmosphere. We can actually now map where these areas are that have been burned. We can actually do measurements that we could never do even 10 years ago. So I think it's really important not to just take the headlines and just dismiss it, but think, well, actually, we have all these different competing interests, and maybe it is a more complex situation, but we might actually all have to make some sacrifices in the fact that whichever way we go, either we're going to be flooded out, we're going to be burnt out, or we're going to have to find something else, to try to understand how we can best help. It's no use just saying, oh, I'm only going to plant trees, because that's not necessarily the best approach. It could be that planting trees in the right place, in the right environment, is correct. But it isn't just about, you can't just, I don't think, plant a rainforest in that sense. That's a natural system.
Just as a final question to you, you've spoken there a lot about the complexity of the situation. And in recent years, we've heard the term come about, I think it was climate anxiety, and I've seen reports of that among younger people as well. As Christians, how do we approach the topic of climate change, especially when it feels like the information is constantly changing, or it feels like we're kind of helpless when it comes to dealing with climate change?
Actually, I think young people are in a great position because they've got a more active and inquisitive mind. They're not sort of fixated on particular situations. And I think as long as we go out and educate ourselves and think, well, are there ways we can think about this? Is there something I can do? And there are a number of people who have made some incredibly important approaches. You've got, I suppose, even with the Earthshock Prize and stuff, people are thinking of ways in which they can help different types of environment. I think that's very important. And I think as a young person, you have access to a lot of information. You can actually compute that information more easily than a lot of older people who are sort of fixated on what they learnt at school. And I think that's the problem, is that we tend to live in the world in which we finished our schooling. And especially in many fields, it's only if you're in education like myself, where you're sort of forever having to update. I think most people sort of live in their sort of educational past. If you're a young person, don't be anxious, just be thinking about how we can understand. And there are so many ways that we can contribute even in our scientific understanding, let alone the way we might pray as a Christian. Even if we're involved don't just believe everything that you hear. Try to find out from people who actually know. And I think that is the key. Speak to a forester or speak to somebody who's involved in fighting the fire. What are the problems that they face? Is there a way that we can help? If you're, say, getting involved in planning or building, think about the materials you're using. Think about spaces needed for fire breaks and so on. There's so many things that we can think about, and rather than just go along with, we've always done this in the past, therefore we should do it in the future. Just think about the different aspects, and that actually one thing that you do might have an effect on something else. Think about that. I think trying to understand consequences is actually the most difficult thing to grasp. But young people have that chance to think through different systems much better.
Well, Andrew, thanks so much for coming on to the programme today. It's been great to hear from you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.